I think understanding Spring Hill is the heart of understanding Franklin, because I think without really understanding what happened and didn't happen on November 29th, it's, I think, much more difficult to understand why John Bell Hood does what he ultimately decided to do.
So here we are at the Spring Hill battlefield, and we're standing really just a bit inside of part of the U.S. defensive position. George Wagner's division gets here just before noon, and he deploys his troops southeast of town, where we are, east of town and to the north of town. The troops that were set up in this area were part of Luther Bradley's brigade. He has a handful of regiments up on this hill, which at the time the troops were here, they were hidden up in this timber, and then off to my front, which is a bit west of here, were 2 regiments of Bradley's brigade. And he really has dual purpose. He's watching, monitoring for activities toward Columbia Pike, and also monitoring activities up the Rally Hill Pike, because the Confederate troops who had crossed the Duck River earlier in the day were moving up the Davis Ford Road, and the Davis Ford Road links up with Rally Hill Pike, and so this is logically where the Confederates are going to come from, and sure enough they do. And at about 3:45 that afternoon, Frank Cheatham's corps begins arriving on the field not far south of here, kind of beyond the tree line. Pat Cleburne's division begins advancing, and Cleburne's division begins moving toward Columbia Pike, because Hood's objective is to block the road and prevent Schofield's army from retreating from Columbia north toward Franklin.
Well, when I started researching it and then ultimately started writing about it, I was interested in not just what happened on that day, but why. Why did John Bell Hood launch this invasion of Tennessee this late in the war? And I think that's really at the heart of it. Nashville had been the first capital to fall to U.S. soldiers early in the war. So it's trying to drag it out. It's trying to prolong the war, trying to keep hope alive. When John Bell Hood makes this effort to move into Tennessee, there's a lot of discussion going on between President Lincoln and General Grant and General Sherman about what to do. And so ultimately, they begin developing a sort of defensive strategy. And that's where John Schofield comes into play. So Schofield and Hood have a sort of equal number of troops, Hood slightly more than Schofield. But Schofield's job was to slow Hood down. And that's what he's attempting to do between really Pulaski and Columbia.
Cleburne's men run into Bradley's troops in this general vicinity and west of here, and a very sharp fight erupts. Cleburne's division alone takes 250, 300 casualties. Bradley's brigade is badly mauled. One of his regiments, the 42nd Illinois, which was positioned west of here, suffered almost 50% casualties just in a matter of moments. Bradley himself, in fact, is badly wounded and barely dragged off the field. What happens here is Cleburne's men push Bradley's troops off this hill in this direction toward the north, and this running pursuit begins to play out, and Cleburne's men advance several hundred feet north of here.
I don't think that John Bell Hood or Jefferson Davis, who ultimately sanctioned the movement, would have ever attempted it had they believed for a moment that they couldn't possibly be successful. And not just that the campaign could be successful, but that they could still win the war. I think sometimes it's easy to forget this campaign actually goes on for the better part of 2 months, from very late October until late December.
So down into this area is really one of, not just one of my favorite parts of this battlefield, but I think really one of the more poignant. Pat Cleburne's men, largely 2 of his brigades, Dan Govan's and Mark Lowrey's, pursue Bradley's troops into this area, pushing down toward this low ground. And it's in this area that Cleburne's men begin taking artillery fire. A battery of 4 guns positioned just north of here, near, at the time, Martin Chaires' home, begins shelling Cleburne's troops furiously and begins to break up his advance. And of course you can see the terrain's not exactly conducive to effective pursuit. As they come under fire over this ground, Cleburne's men begin hitting the creek, which is right here in the tree line. They really don't get much further than that. Some of them did advance beyond the creek into what was then a cornfield, but they're quickly pushed back. And why I think this area of the battlefield is so important is because anybody who's studied Spring Hill or Franklin or just the Western theater of the Civil War in general knows who Pat Cleburne was. And I've for many years informally called this area Cleburne's last bivouac, because Pat Cleburne and many of his men spent their last night on earth camped down in this area and stretching out for several hundred yards in each direction, because let's not forget, Cleburne commands 3,000 men, so they're not just in this really small area, but in this general vicinity. many of them spent that night on November 29th as the entire U.S. Army is moving up the road northward toward Franklin. They don't have any idea what's really transpiring 400, 500, 600 yards west of here. We are at least 500 yards from the road. And that's important to point out because when the U.S. Army was moving, if you were in this area, and especially when you consider the terrain, hills and ridgelines tend to mask not just what you can see, but they also tend to mask sound. And so in this area, you would likely not have been able to hear very much at all. And add to that the idea that an entire army moving under cover of darkness was not a normal occurrence. So almost everything is playing against the Confederate troops that evening.
What happens on the night of November 27th is Hood lays out the plans for what would happen on November 29th. Throughout the next day, November 28th, the Confederate cavalry begins aggressively pushing out to try and screen this movement that Hood has planned for November 29th. And so the Southern Army advances on the morning of November 29th, leaving a portion of the army in Columbia. The remaining 2/3 of it swings out to the east in an effort to use a military term, to flank John Schofield's army. And the goal is midway between Columbia and Franklin, this little place called Spring Hill. And so late that afternoon, the Confederate army, with Hood at the head of it, is approaching the southeast side of town, and little could any of them know what was about to unfold. Now, when you get right down to it, is there was so much confusion about not only what did not happen, but what did happen. And then the whole thing is overshadowed by the just horrific bloodshed the next day at Franklin. It's easy to oversimplify it, to look at it and say, well, it was this, and there was this series of mistakes, or this series of successes, and then you get to the end result. And I think Spring Hill is a case of this misunderstanding. It wasn't just what the Confederates were doing. It was what John Schofield and the U.S. Army was doing that has much to do with that night as anything. John Schofield moves his entire army, well over 25,000 men, from Columbia, Tennessee through Spring Hill all the way to Franklin, so somewhere 25, 26 miles. He does it under cover of darkness on one single road, moving thousands of animals, hundreds of wagons, scores of artillery pieces, within a couple of hundred yards of the enemy. Talk about daring.
We're now in the area where Confederate troops came closest to Columbia Pike. This ground was slated to be developed, and the Trust rescued it. It's adjacent to Rippavilla, which is the scene of a rather well-known meeting the next morning between Hood and several of his subordinate commanders, but that's how close we are to the Columbia Pike. Today, U.S. Highway 31, it's that road that was used by the U.S. Army that night as they escaped. But just before sundown on the 29th of November, William Bate's troops, part of Cheatham's corps, had come within maybe 100 yards of the road, so they're right out here in the field. Bate actually had the road within sight. But he, like Pat Claiborne and like John Brown, were ordered to pull back, reposition for a later attack which never came.
I think that John Bell Hood tried to block the Columbia Turnpike, tried to get his subordinates to block the Columbia Turnpike. They made their earnest efforts to try to do so, but nobody actually got the road blocked. Somewhere between Oaklawn and Rippavilla, John Bell Hood must have been boiling over that morning on November 30th. It was every possible way to either minimize Spring Hill or to turn it into something that it never was. One of the things I always thought was interesting is the people who would argue that John Schofield had multiple escape routes that night. No, he did not. John Schofield certainly never considered that he had any other alternatives other than Columbia Pike. He certainly couldn't go east. He wasn't going to go west. He wasn't going to move up the railroad bed. He knew what faced him that night, and Hood knew full well the opportunity that had been lost. Spring Hill was a casualty of time. In fact, until 20 years ago, you would have found people who would even argue that there was ever a battle there. And there were somewhere in the neighborhood of 700, 750 casualties. Now that pales in comparison to Franklin, but this wasn't some minor little skirmish. This was an incredibly sharp, intense fight. I think the best thing that's happened to Spring Hill is that Franklin's story has been resurrected to some degree, which allows us to look at the Battle of Spring Hill and allows us to look at the campaign in a more proper perspective. That's a place where you can actually see how opportunity is frittered away and how soldiers, sometimes we view them as these immortals, like they're some Greek and Roman gods battling it out. They were just like us, placed in unbelievably unique, dangerous, confusing circumstances. You almost see the war winding down. You see an army grappling against time. You see a commander in above his head. He's the Peter Principle. He's a great division and brigade commander, in command of an army that wasn't acting cohesively. And then on the other side, an army that knows they have one chance to get away. There is no doubt that there's something present in the Army of Tennessee on the afternoon of November 30th, 1864, that ties directly to Spring Hill. But I think it also ties all the way back to the early days of the war. And this was it.
Can you hear me? Sound good? Yes? No?
Yep,
Tell me when you're ready.
I'm ready.
There you go. Want to get the creek? I find your lack of faith disturbing. Are you ready?